Hello everyone, welcome as every Sunday to our self-knowledge course. Just allow me 1 second to verify if everything is okay with the broadcast. So we start with today's lecture. Yeah, I think everything is okay. Okay, so today we have lecture number 14 of this set of 50 lectures that we are broadcasting for free as part of this self-knowledge course that we are broadcasting every Sunday at the same time through this page. Today we are going to talk about a very important and very interesting topic, and it is drugs and alcohol. And this lecture is actually very important because it's going to show us the urgency of eliminating these two defects from us, since they make any progress in the inner work impossible. And it is important to realize that all of us, to a greater or a lesser level, have nurtured these defects. But it often happens that we understand that only those who we consider addicts have a problem with alcohol or drugs. But today we are going to analyze how, little by little, if we don't work on the small details that lead us to give in to these defects, we will end up falling to ever greater levels. So let's start with today's lecture. That is one of the objectives of this lecture, to make us reflect about the urgency of eliminating these defects from us and make us understand that even though we are not addicts, or maybe we are, but if we are not, even there, we need to work on these defects. And in addition, another objective of this lecture will be to know how to help people affected by these two aspects to regenerate themselves. We are going to see that no matter how deep we have fallen into drugs or alcohol, we can get out of it. And today we're going to see how we can do it, and we are also going to see that if we study and if we eliminate these defects within ourselves, no matter the level that we have nurtured these defects, we will be able to help others to eliminate them better. Today we are going to first talk about alcoholism. We are going to talk about drugs, and then we are going to talk about how to get out from this, how to free ourselves from these chains, how to work and to eliminate these defects from our own psychology. Let's start talking about alcoholism. But to make an objective understanding of this subject, we are going to approach this defect of alcoholism for what it really is. But allow me just a second. Let me check something over here. Just a second, because I think I'm having like a problem here. Let me see. Okay, I think it's okay. Hi Magda, how are you? Okay, I was saying that we are going to approach this defect of alcoholism for what it really is: a very strong and a very subtle demon, which slowly and very pleasantly attracts and traps us until it manages to dominate and subdue us. So we are going to know about this demon. We are going to learn about its modus, its characteristics. We are going to see the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual consequences of alcoholism. So let's start talking about this demon. And we need to understand that all processes of drug addiction and alcoholism on this planet and within each one of us are driven by a defect or a force or a concentration of negative energy that's so strong that it's really a demon. This demon is known by the name of alcohol or alcohol for the Arabs, which means body eating spirit. And that is actually the etymological origin of the word alcohol. And Algol, it is also the name of the demon star in the constellation of Perseus, and it is also represented by the head of Medusa, which was slain by Perseus in the Greek mythology. And all of this is related to something that's so common to us nowadays, which is alcohol, but that is one of the fastest ways to lower our vibration. And it's been used as a tool to keep human consciousness at a lowered state for thousands of years. Actually, if we want to awaken our consciousness, it is very important to study these topics. So, let us see, as I said, the modus and characteristics that define this demon of alcohol, which is a demon of alcohol, and how these are fulfilled in our lives when we allow ourselves to be carried away by this defect so that we realize the seriousness of the problem represented by this. So, the modus of this demon are, well, the first one is that it is the owner of the planet. And we can easily see that alcoholism is one of the biggest causes of accidents and heinous crimes that we see on the planet. But at the same time, we can also see that we can find it freely everywhere. Absolutely all of us, in one way or another, are frequently faced with a situation that leads us to consume alcohol, since it is present at any social or any business meeting, actually on a birthday party, at meals, and usually when we think about distracting ourselves, relaxing, and having fun, alcohol is always present. And it is ironic to think how something that at the time was illegal and prosecuted by law, today is something very normal and desirable, despite its unavoidable consequences. Therefore, we see how slowly and seductively this demon has been taking over the planet, since currently it is very rare to find someone who doesn't consume alcohol, even to a minimal degree. And we can even see how young people and even children are faced themselves every time at a younger age with the temptation to consume alcohol or drugs. Another of the modus of this demon is that it's I am the thief of solar atoms. And what does it mean? We have been explaining in the lectures since so far the importance of our energy, especially our sexual energy for inner work, for spiritual birth. Our energy in its pure form is composed of solar atoms that, correctly used through suprasexuality, have the ability to regenerate us, to regenerate our physical and our vital bodies, turning us into strong, into healthy people with full vitality. But it also allows us to create ourselves internally an astral, a mental, and a causal bodies so that we can be beings of awakened consciousness in this dimension, but also in the higher dimensions of nature. But both alcohol and drugs rot the sexual energy, turning those solar atoms into involutional lunar atoms, thus making any advance in the inner work, well, impossible. Another of the motives is that I'm the father of corruption and misfortune. And it is totally like that. Any sense of ethics and morals relaxes and is distorted after a few good drinks. We also see that the biggest causes or the biggest cause of car accidents is represented by driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. We can see how it always leads us to act driven by our lowest instincts. We see that on many occasions, alcohol is the cause of misfortune reaching the families. The drunkard believes that he drives very well and that alcohol doesn't affect his senses. And then the news comes out of another tragic death because of alcohol or drug abuse. Another of its motives is that it is also the father of degeneration and vice. And we see that alcohol, for example, has a peculiarity of inhibiting the personality. So anyone can have a shy personality, which makes it difficult for him or for her to socialize, to talk to strangers, or to speak in front of a public. And there's always someone who suggests consuming a little alcohol, saying that it will help you to relax and to open up. But actually, this is going through a false door, which will not really help you solve the problem, but will enslave you. Because when drinking alcohol effectively, that will inhibit the personality, and the person will feel safe and will feel brave. But actually, it has not generated any real change in itself. Since that will last, that I don't know, braveness will last as long as the effect lasts. And to return to achieve that extroverted state, each time will need a higher dose. And thus you become dependent and slowly enslave yourself to this, gradually degenerating. We start with a few drinks, but as we consume more, heavier ways of being come out that lead us to make mistakes that we can only regret later. We see what happens, for example, when a person goes to a party. At first, he's looking for, he's just like looking at the environment, calm, even shy. But as he begins to drink, or she begins to drink, one and another drink, different, like animals' ways of being are manifested within himself. With a few drinks, the parrot is the first to come out, and the person start talking and talking non-stop. But after few more drinks, the monkey come out, and now that person start to mix joke and laugh, non-stop. But a few more drinks, and the peacock comes out. Sorry. And begins to show the feathers, and the person begins to talk about his achievements, to show pictures, to philosophize, to show himself. But a few more drinks, and then the gorilla comes out, and that is the one who now wants to fight with everyone. And a few more drinks, and then the pig comes out, the one who lives with anyone, who is no longer like selective, who now only wants to fornicate and end up there with anyone doing anything. And the next day, that person doesn't remember what did and can check the phone and sees that he or she calls the ex at midnight, or that receives pictures of the show that did in the bar last night, or wakes up in an unfamiliar room with a person who doesn't know at all, or wakes up in the hospital, and then comes, the terrible hangover, and I will never drink again, which is never fulfilled, and all nasty consequences. But happens that later, that becomes just a funny story to tell, and maybe a few weeks later, the desire to repeat appears again. And so we are falling into that vicious circle from which it is no longer so easy to get out. And it is very interesting to observe, and I think it is one of those subtle ways in which this demon traps us. And it is that we think that we can control it, that those who fall into vices are weak people, but that we are not. And it is just as we are given given in to consume a little, then a little more. Slowly we take like the taste and we include it more and more. You see that at first we only have, I don't know, a beer from time to time to share, to watch a football game, but then the amount of beers increases. And later we include a glass of wine on special occasions or with meals, but then a glass of whiskey to close the business, or simply out of habit at the end of the day, or a champagne for very special occasions, and the shot of tequila, to share with friends and have a good time, and mixed drinks for the girls to try new things, like, I don't know, mojitos or Mai Tai, and little by little, we don't realize how suddenly we are consuming alcohol too often. But slowly, it has become just normal for us. But what happens, as we have been seeing in the different lectures, we have many existences as humans. We don't only live once. And when the physical body dies, our psychological defects, which are the ones that have trapped the 97% of our essence, do not die, but return in the next existence to express themselves again in us, to continue growing and becoming stronger and submit us more and more. That is why we see that, for example, if a group of teenagers try drugs or alcohol at the same time, some of them get hooked more easily than others. And this is because for some it will be their first existence consuming alcohol or drugs, but for others will already have many lives feeding these defects, and these are becoming stronger. And in this existence, when they begin to consume, they quickly become hooked and fall into vice. Hence, the need to stop and eliminate these defects, regardless of the level of consumption we have, regardless of whether we believe we can control them. With drugs and alcohol, we shouldn't make compromises or negotiations. We must radically eliminate them. Another of the motives of this defect of alcohol is I am the destroyer of homes. It is too common to see how domestic violence is usually based on its consumption. How this defect bring out in a person its more cruel defects, capable of hurting and even killing those who supposedly love the most. How we can see how vice make us insensitive, how this can become so strong that when under its effect, the ability to reason and even to feel is clouded. And we see how a drunk or a drug addict father begins to neglect his fundamental duties of supplying food, shelter, clothing, and education for his family because money is now being spent on vice. We see also how the moment when the wife claims him, he acts with violence, abusing her. And we also see how the alcohol or the drug addict son causes pain to his family, who with regret see as he is hurting himself and as he steal and hurt others. So it is very important to reflect on the consequences of these defects to realize that definitely it is the cause of misery and ruin. Let's now see some of the characteristics of this demon. And these are some characteristics that is important to consider. For example, that it lubricates the wheel of samsara. As I explained before, when we create the defects for the first time, we generate a recurrence, and in each existence at the same age and sometimes earlier, it will manifest again. And each time we give in to the glass, to the shot, the defect grows and it becomes stronger. And each time it submits us more, it enslaves us more, and more quickly it destroys us. So it leads us to die earlier. If we have the opportunity in each cycle to 108 existences to achieve realization as humans, but we don't eliminate this defect, if in one existence we died because of this defect at the age of 50, for example, in the next existence, as we got hooked faster and consumed more, consequently, we will no longer reach 50, and at 40 we died, and so on. Our existences are shortened, and therefore our possibilities to achieve self-realization are exhausted faster. For that reason, it is said that it lubricates the wheel of samsara, because we are like going faster. Another of its characteristic is that it insinuates itself whatever, in any place, always tempting. We must begin to observe and become aware of how alcohol is everywhere. Even at the children's party, there is no lack of alcohol, but for adults. But giving the children the signal from an early age that drinking alcohol is okay and that it is something to aspire to when they grow up. If we think about it, it was early in our lives when that morbid curiosity of tasting alcohol was like sunning us, because we saw the grown-ups drink and having fun, but we never realized the consequences that it brought to them. And actually, that from that age, we always had that curiosity until one day we had the opportunity to taste it, and then to continue, using it and maybe to get hooked. Another of the characteristics is that it can be like disguised as something very fine and very diplomatic. And we actually feel very sophisticated, like drinking, for example, Scotch whiskey, or champagne, or martini, or a gin and tonic. And if you are going to close a very important business, you cannot miss the drink. And how we could feel pressure if the boss or a person we consider important invite us to a sophisticated drink and we want to reject it. We could also observe those eyes or those ways of being that consider themselves important because they buy expensive drinks, or because I have a mini bar with selected drinks at home or in the office. These are all the ways this demon dress up in elegance and sophistication to look desirable and make us feel like we need it. But it also seems to have like the talent of ubiquity. It appears in any place. Thus we see how everywhere, regardless of the social class, the age, the gender, or the race, we can find it. It is important that we begin to study these defects in ourselves, and that we study like all the situations, that we reflect when it's begun, in which ways I consume it, and which ways of being moving us in each situation. We must observe like the defects that manifested in me when I consume beer, and I must study and eliminate the eyes that likes to consume beer. And I must study, for example, when I consume vodka or tequila or whatever the means in which this alcohol defects has manifested itself in my life. Also, we must see the relationship with other defects, such as smoking or idle conversations, etc. We must actually study all of this, because from there we are going to rescue a lot of wisdom, and as by eliminating all these defects, we are going to rescue a lot of power, a lot of courage to get out from this. Let's see, before talking about drugs, the consequences of using or the alcohol defect. And the consequences of alcoholism, beyond the physical and the psychological consequences that this defect bring us, and that are actually widely known, like how it terribly damages like the liver or the esophagus, the pancreas, how it damages the sexual apparatus, generating impotence, and how it brings birth defects to the ones that are pregnant, and the babies, or how it affects like the ability to concentrate, for example. Let's look at the spiritual consequences, since these are, let's say, like less known. Some of the spiritual consequences of this defect are that, for example, it ends the possibilities of being. So we see that, for example, a young man who had perhaps many aspirations in his life, many plans to study this or to become that, by getting involved in alcohol at an early age, ruins his chances of achieving those goals, and from achieving his dreams. But in relation to the self-realization, that is our true objective in this existence, will be totally impossible if we don't radically eliminate the defect of alcoholism, since it doesn't allow us to advance in the interior work. It prevents us from advancing in the work on the three factors of the revolution of the consciousness. Allow me just a second to check something here in the program. Sorry. And why I say that it prevents us from advancing in the work on the three factors of revolution of the consciousness that we know are psychological death, spiritual birth, and sacrifice for humanity. Because since alcohol revives dead defects, in other words, each time we consume alcohol, we will lose the progress we are making in the psychological death. In addition, it is a defect that damages our energy, preventing us from achieving chastity. And even more, it leads us to the worst violence in sex, since this defect gives way to expressing our heaviest lust defects. A person who is drinking alcohol falls much more easily into fornication, into adultery, even promiscuity, orgies, and sexual practices that perhaps they wouldn't agree to being sober, since it dulls the senses and the moral just relaxes, and in a drunken state, we are more influenced by any suggestion. This defect increases the weakness, so it steals from us that revolutionary force that leads us to deny ourselves to our desires. Under the effect of alcohol, we easily fall into ill will, and we give in more easily to the temptation of any defect, of any kind. But it also stimulates fantasy, and therefore the person doesn't see life in an objective way, doesn't even see the consequences of their action, are carried away just by pleasure, and wants to live a life of sex, drugs, and rock and roll to the edge without stopping to reflect how it ruins and shortens his life, in addition to cutting off his own possibilities of some spiritual growth. Actually, this defect develops irresponsibility and non-compliance. And we see this widely in how a person to satisfy his vice, begins to miss his daily responsibilities. But for example, in relation to the sacrifice for humanity, this defect weakens us, desensitizes, and doesn't allow us to develop the love that is to act for the good of others. But it also weakens the ethical sense. It destroys the human part of the individual. It's like animalizes. We see how that sensitivity that make us human is atrophy in that person, um, and his partner, his friends, his family members can beg him to leave this vice, that he's hurting himself and those who love him. But while under the influence of this demon, the person like loses his human part, becomes animalistic, reacts with violence, becoming capable of committing crimes and not explaining later how he was able to do this or that thing, ruining many times his life forever, being taken in a moment of intoxication to commit heinous acts. But to regain that sensitivity, that control over his own mind and emotion, the person must cleanse himself and work on himself. And we must understand that the consequences of pleasure are always pain. And if we don't learn to deny ourselves those pleasures that alcohol and drugs give us, nothing is going to prevent us from having to face the pain of the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual consequences. After, let's see, finishing talking about alcoholism, let's talk about some warnings that are important to keep in mind. The first one is that with this defect, we must be radical. We cannot think of living this little by little, believing that we will be able to consume less or only on special occasions, since this demon is very treacherous. And when we least expect it, he stabs us in the back, making us fall lower than before by waiting for us to find ourselves in a favorable situation. I don't know, like a sentimental situation when our partner left us, or when being fired from work, or that we lose a loved one, or that there is something very important to celebrate, or that someone arrived and who we haven't seen for a long time, who invite us to drink, and how are we going to deny and embitter the moment. And that way it sneaks in and make us fall in a terrible way. So we must be radical. And something very important is that if we are teaching this knowledge to other people, we have the responsibility to set an example to the people who listen to our teachings. So, to eradicate these defects, we must be radical, not a single drop more. We are going now to talk a little about drugs, and then I'm going to explain the concrete steps to eliminate these two defects in a radical way. So let's talk now a little about drugs. The scourge of drugs is even stronger than alcoholism, as it produces much more pleasure in the person. Also, the consequences are stronger and are perceived in a shorter term. People get hooked much more easily when they want to give up the vice. They feel totally weak before this defect. They try repeatedly to leave it and come back and fall. And each failure in the attempt of leaving it reaffirms that sense of weakness before before the drugs, and to understand that it is totally possible for each of us to get off drugs no matter how hooked we are or how long we have been using. It is important to understand the psychological unfolding. Understanding this will give us like a great tip to get out from this. And the psychological unfolding tell us that inside each one of us there are two men, the outer man and the inner man. The outer man is that egoic way of being with multiple attitudes and reactions with which we commonly express ourselves in this external world, which is just like a puppet moved by invisible strings that are our psychological defects. That outer man represents our weakness, the one who always feels that he has been paid badly, that feels sorry for himself, that considers himself too much, and feels weak in front of this or any defect. We think that this outer man is all that is, but the psychological unfolding shows us the reality of the inner man. And the inner man is our authentic being. It is processed in other very different lives. He could never be turned into a robot by the psychological defects. When we manage to discover and recognize within ourselves that particular water, that source of strength, wisdom, and love that resides in the consciousness of each one of us, when we try to act in life according to the fundamental principles that we carry deep within our being, actually we can feel the difference. For our being, eliminating the defect of drugs or alcohol, it is not difficult. Our being understands that these defects have trapped a large portion of our consciousness and a lot of wisdom, and that facing and eliminating them will pay off with great strength and encouragement for inner work. Since all the spirit that we currently have to feed the defect, we will steal it from it by denying the desire and imposing our will on the will of the defect. That way, we are going to release fire and spirit that were previously subjected to the defect, but now will work towards our consciousness and towards the liberation of all our consciousness. And all the understanding and wisdom that we rescue will help us to help others to get out of that slavery. Since each defect that we understood is our own wisdom, is a knowledge of oneself. And whoever has eliminated these defects can more easily help others to get out of there. If we don't recognize that higher part in ourselves, it will be difficult for us to face this and any defect. We will feel weak, incapable. But for that inner man that we all carry inside to begin to manifest, first we must be able to recognize one's own nothingness and inner misery. When one has the courage to review his life, to look at and face his own mistakes, and to develop conscious faith, which is the faith that is obtained through the practice and the direct experimentation of the knowledge, we start like manifesting that inner man. And that is a point that is very important, that we all realize that inside of us we have the force, that we have a great water that have all the strength to get out from drugs and from alcohol. It is something that is another thing that is important to review about drugs and are the hypnotic hallucination. When discovering and experimenting a real connection with our being, with that superior part within ourselves, will let us know what really happens when a person takes drugs. And it is that the person enters an altered state of consciousness that even they can think it is something superior, something conscious. Actually, it is not. No, it is not. What people call a trip, give me just a second. Sorry. What people call a trip, which almost always results in a bad trip, where commonly very pleasant hallucinations are had, although other times very frightening and unpleasant hallucinations of the egoic consciousness that have their origin in something that is called the conda buffer organ. And what does it mean? If we remember the lecture of the dimensions and where they are in us, we saw that there are dimensions higher than this third dimension, and that to inhabit them permanently, we should do a work of regeneration and awakening of consciousness through the three factors of the revolution of the consciousness. But that we can experience the reality of them and visit them, those higher dimensions, through techniques such as meditation or conscious astral projection. But we saw that there are also dimensions lower than this third dimension that constitute our infradimensions or our infernal worlds. And it happens that when we get high with any type of drug, whether synthetic or natural, such as the mystical drugs, such like marijuana, ayahuasca, hallucinogenic mushrooms, etc., we think that we are experiencing a higher dimensional reality. But actually, we are only experiencing mere hallucinations from our own infradimensions. And we delude ourselves into believing that they are mystical, superior experiences. But if we reflect, we realize that in these trips, we don't have control over ourselves. We don't have the ability to move at will. We are not able to say if the one we see or speak to us is really a superior being. We don't have the ability to conjure it or consciously ask for guidance regarding any problem or concern we have. When we begin to work on ourselves and to consciously and at will experience the reality of the higher dimensions of nature, we discover the unreal and the subjective of these psychedelic experiences. It is necessary to understand that drugs can never cause the awakening of consciousness. That is something very important to take into account. Let's now check at some of the consequences of drugs. We will see that drugs brings us the same consequences of alcoholism, but in addition to those consequences, in relation to the physical body, we see how they affect, like for example, the sexual apparatus, causing the person to reach sexual impotence prematurely. And we also see how quickly the physical body degenerates and destroys. Since a young man who begins to ingest drugs in a short time is made like a decrepit old man. And another very harmful feature of these defects is that it opens gates. If we remember the lecture about the infradimensions, there we saw that in our lower abdomen there are 7 gates through which the psychological defects enter to the several centers of our human machine to manifest and to feed off our energy. Let's say that in a person who doesn't consume, these gates are small, and through them just low, let's say low voltage defects come out that lead people to make not so serious errors, according, of course, to the psychological degeneration they have. But the drug consumption widens these internal gates. And if before, for example, the defect of anger that manifested itself led the person to scream and weep, actually, under the effect of drugs, the size of the voltage of the defect of anger that is now expressed in that person already leads him to hurt or even kill a person. Or you can see, for example, the defect of lust in a person who is not consuming can lead him to vent his lust with maybe pornography or masturbation. But under the effects of drugs, the lust that is manifested can lead a person to rape another and do all kinds of sexual perversions. And these heavy defects use up enormous amounts of energy and literally suck the person. Then we see how the vital body, or we could see how the vital body of a drug addict is like fading, disintegrating the vital part. Remember that the vital body is that energetic part or aura that gives life to the physical body. And that energetic part, as the person degenerates sexually, loses its shine. And we see how the drug addict loses even the tone of his skin and turns like gray until it looks like a corpse. But also we can see, for example, the astral body of a drug addict, and we'll see how his astral body is walking like an idiot, like an unreal man, doing all sort of things. But if we go higher, we can see, like in the mental body, how terrible damages can be seen since the alpha rays are annihilated. And therefore, those intrinsic connections between mind and brain become lost, and the person loses the ability to concentrate. If we examine the brain of a drug addict, we can see how the brain tissue of the mental body is completely destroyed. And in the causal body, we can see how the essence suffer the consequences of drugs, since this dull the consciousness. And we can see the essence of the person. It looks like a drunk looking for where to fall. Actually, that is the state of a drug addict in his interior. And now, since we have extensively seen the characteristics and the consequences of these two defects, let's see how we can eliminate these defects, which is the most important part of this lecture. The first step to eliminate these defects is to have the desire and the courage to do so. It is impossible to force someone who doesn't want to quit the habit to leave it. So someone can really eliminate this defect in a definitive way, but for that they must feel the desire to change, the desire to work on themselves, to achieve their own self-realization. So if the person is interested in changing and getting out of that situation in which he or her finds, then he should take the next steps. First, practice the self-observation. And what is going to self-observe? Well, it's going to self-observe each of the desires and emotions that have in relation to alcohol or drugs. Let us remember that self-observation is to direct our attention towards ourselves at any time to discover each form of the defect that wants to manifest within us, to lead us to fall into feeding this defect again. So we are going to self-observe each desire, for example, that when I get up, that desire to consume or to smoke the joint rises. Or after the meal, I see how I feel the anxiety or the desire to call such person because I know he always has and he shares with me, etc. And we must keep like a constant vigil to observe and to discover each of those desires. But we are also going to observe the emotions we feel. That emotions of, for example, displeasure or anxiety, despair, that wants to lead me to weaken and to want to consume. But we will also going to observe each of the intellectual justifications for drinking or consuming drugs. Like some of the justifications, for example, this is the last time, or one more and that's it, or that I'm only going to, I don't know, accompany that person, but I'm not going to drink or consume. Or that it is only for that occasion because it is a special occasion. Or any of the thousands of justifications with which the defect can come out in the mind for us to give in and feed it. And we also must observe each of the acts of ill will to do what the defect wants. Like the moment we want to send everything to hell and give up and give in, and we get up and we go to get the drink or to get the drug. So we must be alert to constantly observe all these emotions, desires, emotions, justifications, and the ill will. And the second step, we are not going just to self-observe. The second step is to discover and eliminate. So we are going to deny ourselves to do the will of the defect. And for each of the discoveries that we make with self-observation, we must ask our Divine Mother, who represents, the power and the love of our consciousness, to eliminate that detail from us. So if I discover inside of me the anxiety, I know I'm feeling it, or the despair, or I discover those thoughts or that mechanical imagination that lead us to, idolize those moments in which we consume, and especially those details of ill will that will lead us to finally fall, we are going to ask for death for every detail, asking our Divine Mother, eliminate this defect from me. And we are going to discover how inside of us resides a great force. Once we observe a detail of the defect, we recognize it is the defect that wants me to fall. We discover that. We ask for that. We ask our unconsciousness to eliminate that. We are going to see that in a time that may be relative short, we will begin to dominate that psychological self. Another of the recommendations, and one I think is very important, is to get out of the circle of friends with whom we usually drink or consume drugs. Since to eliminate this defect, we will need all our willpower. And if we continue to frequent the same places and the same people with whom we used to consume, we will be constantly facing, temptation. And at first, we could believe that we will be alone, but it is not like that. When eliminating these defects, our level of being will raise, and therefore, by law of affinity, just as before we attracted all the time drunks and drug addicts around us, now we will attract people with a higher vibration. And another recommendation is to practice the dervishes and the sublimation. And that is something that helps a lot to detoxify the body and to regenerate the neurons of our brain. And the practices of the wishes and sublimations are actually practices that we are going to see later in the course, but the wishes are exercises that help us to unload and detoxify the liver, as well as it helps us to align our three brains. And the sublimation consists of covering the right nostril while inhaling. Imagine how the energy rises from the right sexual gland in this way we see here in the graph up to the brain. And we exhale the air through the mouth, vocalizing the like that. Then we are going to cover the left nostril as we inhale, and we imagine how our sexual energy rises from the left gonad until it reaches the brain, and we exhale with the mouth. And this practice is repeated for a maximum of 10 minutes. And we are going to see how great benefits we receive from such an easy practice. And actually, to get more out of these practices, it is good to do them in the early hours of the morning, between 4:30 and 6 in the morning, since at this time the air is like purer, and hopefully we have the facility to go out to an open space like a park, and actually always do it accompanied by someone. And as we recover, if we have a partner, it is important to start practicing the sexual transmutation to regenerate with our sexual energy our physical body, and to start, as you know, creating the internal bodies while working also with the psychological death, eliminating all the defects that enslave us. But what happens that if we are very hooked, if we feel that the defect is too strong, we can do the practice of negotiation with the law that we learned in the last conference. That is here in the page, in the video sections, which is the lecture Laws of Karma and Dharma. There we saw this practice of negotiation with the law. And we are going to ask in this practice that this defect be imprisoned, and we are going to commit to working on them every day until we eliminate them. And when internally the I is imprisoned, it manifests itself in us, but just in a minimal portion, so that we can work on it. And as we reflect, as we understand, and as we eliminate and refuse to do the will of the self, we will gain more strength, and then another portion of the defect will be released, and then another, until we remove these defects from our psychology completely. This practice is actually highly recommended to do in these cases. And another thing that is important to keep in mind is to understand that in general, the cause of one falling into vices is leisure. As the old saying goes, leisure is the mother of all vices. Therefore, it is important to occupy our time in constructive things. And one of the ways to enter into unlimited occupation is to sacrifice for humanity. If the person who is regenerated uses his time, his energy, to help others to awaken their consciousness, by law of correspondence, he will have the right to be helped internally. And finally, something that is very important and that we must do is reflection. We must invest part of our daily time in reflective meditation. Throughout the day, we will be working with the ongoing death, eliminating, as I said, the desires, the emotions, the justifications, and the ill will. Every day, from time to time, we will be denying the defect. And we will also going to spend a few hours every day to reflect, to meditate on the sins lived with this defect. And to make this reflection, we must ask ourselves some questions, like, for example, how far this defect has taken me, be it alcoholism or drug. What damages has it caused to my physical body? How has it damaged the relationship with my family, with my friends, in work, with other people in general? But above all, how has it damaged my relationship with my own being, with my consciousness? We must reflect also on the number of psychological conflicts that it has brought us in this existence, and how it has influenced our degeneration. And we are going to start reflecting on all these things to take out more and more details from these defects and eliminate them, to reach more and more understanding and have more strength to face the defect. And we realize all the damage that it has caused us, how it damaged our physical body, our sexual organs, how it makes us impotent, how it damaged our brain, how it burnt our neurons, how, for example, it made me lose my partner, my family, etc. Then that will make us deeply need to eliminate those defects from our inner world. And actually, that gives us a lot of strength to face the defect, looking at all those sins lived in which a defect like manifested in us, and looking at what we thought, what we felt, what we wanted in those sins, what mistakes led us to commit that defect, what justifications we had, and what eliminate each one of those details that, well, you observe during these reflective meditations. And doing that will allow us to quickly eliminate that defect, and it will not be something that we will be repressing, as it will be completely eliminated. Actually, it is very important that we get to know that inside of us we have an inner master, we have an inner warrior, that if we work on ourselves will help us to get out completely, to free ourselves from these two aspects, which are drugs and alcohol. Well, and this has been today's lecture, and I remind you, to act in life according to the fundamental principles that we carry deep within our being. And I want to invite you to our next conference that will be next Sunday through this page, and it will be the lecture number 15 of this self-knowledge course, and it's ego, personality, and essence. In this lecture, we are going to learn that beyond desires and appearances, there is a light that tirelessly fights to manifest. And we are going to learn to differentiate the acts of the ego, the acts of the personality, and the acts of the essence. And well, this has been all for today. Let me just read here a question that Angelica McCoy is asking us. It says, psychological aggregates of alcoholism usually work together with aggregates of drugs, different types of addiction, depression, etc. Yes, totally. And for that reason, we must observe all that. When we reflect on these defects, we must observe how it relates with some situation, with certain kind of emotions, with certain states, also with certain type of people. Because we see that when we go out with that person, we end up drinking, or we end up using drugs. But also the emotions, when I'm feeling like sad, or when I'm feeling happy, or when I'm depressed, that lead me to consume. And we need to observe that, to work on that, to eliminate that, so we free ourselves from the situation, from the emotion, but also from the defect of drugs or alcohol. Well, this has been all for today. Thank you for all of you who watched the video. If you have any question, you can write it down in the comments of the video, and we will be asking your question there in the chat. See you next Sunday. Have a great weekend. Ciao, ciao.